Mehmet and kills him. Sorry, listeners, Mehmet does not die here by a vampire. He didn't actually die until 1481 on another military siege, and he had gone on to win many battles and really build up Constantinople as his imperial capital. Other vampires want to eat Vlad's son, so Vlad releases the son to kill the other vampires and himself. The movie ends with some final voiceover narration that because of Vlad, the Turks never conquered Europe. That's not the case because the Ottoman Empire completely conquers Wallachia and southern Hungary as well, and they're camped out in Central Europe well into the 1500s and 1600s. People will talk about like the Siege of Vienna in 1683, and that's when the Turks are checked, but it's more so that the military technology continues to increase in Western Europe, and with all the gold and resources coming from the New World, that causes the Ottoman economy to crash. The trade routes are bypassed, and Russia becomes a military threat to the north. So it's a bunch of different factors that causes the Ottomans to diminish in power. I'm not going to say decline. Ottomanists don't like that word. So listeners, if you're talking to an Ottomanist, don't talk about the decline of the Ottoman Empire. We're a very fickle bunch about that stuff. Okay, and one last thing I'll mention about the movie. Vlad's wife dies earlier on. We flash forward to the present day where Vlad is now an immortal creature, but he's apparently not a bad vampire. He's going to battle a worse vampire we meet earlier on. He meets what appears to be his reincarnated wife. So the cosmology of this movie is confused. Does it believe in reincarnation and it's a form of Hinduism? Does it have a Christian cosmology? What is it, people? And there's a poem that the two of them quote back and forth constantly throughout the movie. Why think separately of this life and the next when one is born from the last? Time is always too short for those who need it, but for those who love, it lasts forever. That is actually a snippet of a poem from Mevlana or Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet. And it might be weird thinking, why would a prince who lived in the 1400s quote a poet who lived in the 1200s who was Muslim? Listeners, this is something that, despite itself, is actually conceivably historically correct. There's a book from 2005 from Walter Andrews and Mehmet Kalpaklı called The Age of the Beloveds that this basically suggests in the 14 and 1500s, literature in Europe and the Ottoman Empire was influencing each other, even if the writers themselves had no idea this was happening. So the writers argue that there's consistent themes that emerge in Ottoman literature and French literature and English literature that's similar. So we have reasons to believe that there's connection points between these cultures that is causing massive influence. So it is possible. Some would argue that Rumi could have ended up in the hands of Vlad 200 years later. So that's my take on the movie. Lots of things that had no right to be as historically accurate, whether the costume design, whether the way that Vlad understood himself. He's not the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. The whole Ottoman Janissary system, a lot of things that were actually pretty good. So what did you think, Steve? Were there things that you thought was pretty good?
I have to preface this that I did actually like the movie. I thought it was entertaining to watch. I just think that it was a movie that didn't know what it wanted to be. Was it fantasy? Was it trying to be somewhat historically accurate and make the history happen through the fantasy? I think it missed a lot of chances. What I thought early on in the movie was that they were going to explain Vlad the Impaler and what he did historically through the fantasy and the horror. And they just, that all kind of flopped out and it turned into just a standard, monster movie where he's killing thousands of, he basically defeats the 100,000 soldier Ottoman army by himself.
Yes, that's silly, and the movie's confused. They really skip over his impalement. He says earlier on that he doesn't have the resources, so he creates fear. It's not enough to kill someone. You have to terrify your enemy. and I don't, maybe it's a filmmaker's choice where we have to make him our protagonist and likable, but couldn't you somehow go all in and make him this, I don't know, an anti-hero or something, and get into the impalement a lot more and explore the aspects of his cruelty? So that's one part that is off.
I thought for sure that he was going to resist the temptation and not become a vampire and then like heroically die on the third day. Like they set it up to be so perfectly wrapped up in a nice, neat package. And then him surviving. And then in 2014, he's hitting on a woman he meets in the village square who kind of looks like his wife. I mean, that was just such a bad ending.
Yeah, I don't know if it was tacked on because they had dreams of a cinematic universe and that's what they're going for.
I think that's what it felt like. They had another ending, and then once the writers found out midway through, oh yeah, wait, we're gonna have this dark universes thing. Let's try and tie that to get in there. Oh yeah, let's just add this one last scene, and we're ready to go.
Well, I'll just mention one more thing I like, and then seg into how to make it better, because you have a lot, and I love to hear criticisms, but. I mean, the reason why I like this movie is, again, it's a silly movie, but there are so many things that I was shocked that they got right. And maybe it's just because I studied the Ottoman Empire, but hey, that's an Ottoman document. Hey, those costumes are accurate. Hey, the methods of Ottoman warfare, the system of soldier recruitment. They didn't have to get all these things right for such a silly movie, but they did. Compare it to something that takes itself very seriously, like Kingdom of Heaven, that that gets major things completely wrong, but then it's looking you in the eye and telling you, I'm going to tell you how it really was. This is the history that really went down, and then just totally craps the bed of doing it. But then this movie, it's a silly movie. It's only 90 minutes long, and I like that. Silly movies shouldn't be 2 hours and 10 minutes long.
Yeah.
But it gets things right it shouldn't. All right, so how to make it better? All I'll mention,
one thing I will mention before we move on, and I don't know if they inadvertently got this right or if it was wrong. I don't know enough about it, but Romanians and Vlad was an Orthodox Christian, but his lead monk looked like a Franciscan, and I know Vlad went and kind of went back and forth between Western Latin Christianity and Eastern Christianity, and I don't know if that was something that they inadvertently got right or, just kind of threw in a monkey-looking guy.
Yeah, I think they just needed a stock character because he didn't look Orthodox enough. The little bit I do know is his father was part of this Catholic fraternal order of knights. And the boundaries between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, they're more porous than they might be in later years, just because there are discussions of military alliances. The Byzantine Empire was considering Catholic conversion to Catholicism and other things just to fight the united enemy of the Ottomans. Later on, then especially when Russia becomes a world power and starts to support what it sees as its Slavic allies. And you have Habsburg competition that is very self-identified as being Catholic with Russia and her allies in southeastern Europe. Then identities between Catholicism and Orthodoxy really do start to harden, but it's more porous in this time. So shifting to make it better, this is this movie where it blends historical reality with fantasy. It's sort of like the poor man's The Odyssey, or like the poor man's The Iliad, where Troy did exist. We have archaeological evidence of this. We don't know if a battle happened on the scale, but we don't have works of Bronze Age Achaia in this time period. So historians rely a lot on the Iliad, even though it's working in Greek mythology and the gods scheming to use troops. So a better version of this could have been something like that, where it's historically grounded, but then it can weave in its fantasy. So that's what I'll mention. But Steve, what do you think? So how do we make this movie better?
I think it did so many things historically correct, like shockingly. I think if they had gone full bore for a historical movie, but then layered on top the horror and fantasy as like a plot device and not as the main meat of the movie. I think this could have been a great movie.
Yeah.
Sticking to the history with getting the plot along with the, blending in the horror aspect would have made, and that's what I thought they were honestly going for initially in the movie. I think that would have been a very well done movie if they had done that.
Yeah, before all the supernatural shenanigans and bats.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what were some other things that, because you talked more about kind of like the Orthodox Catholic imagery and all that stuff.
Yeah, that was the thing, and I'd like to do a little bit more research on that just for my own interest is, because Romania kind of was an area that blended more Latin culture with the Eastern culture. I did notice that when they were on their march from the castle to the monastery, there was somebody who looked like an Orthodox bishop. And in the monastery, there was, outside of the church was completely covered in Eastern icons. But then I believe it was inside of that church. That church looked very much like a church of maybe the 600s in maybe like Italy or Spain or something, very dark and low ceilings. But there again, Romania is kind of off my radar of what I know about their church culture. I do know a little bit about Vlad, like his capital, I believe it was called Teragovist.
Yeah.
And I don't think they mentioned that at all at the movie. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more development of that part of the history and that part of the culture. They did so much of the history so well. I would have liked to have seen that and it wouldn't have been anything that they had to really overtly do. Like they didn't overtly do a lot of the things with like that poem. They could have, just behind the scenes done a little bit more development of Vlad's history, I think, and that would have been good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like with the Franciscans, I think they do enter Southeast Europe around the 13th or 14th centuries. It's sort of like one of the first kind of introductions of Catholicism into these traditionally Orthodox lands, but probably not Vlad's right-hand man, probably not Franciscan. I think the costume department must have just gotten lazy at that point.
And a little bit more, they could have sprinkled in those the Romanian Germans who the one of his advisors kind of dressed like one of them. The merchant, I can't remember what they're called, but they were really big in Romanian and Wallachian and Transylvanian politics. The Transylvanian Germans. That could have been a little bit of an interesting play on the movie.
Yeah, that group, at some point, Vlad's reign or later, they're persecuted, kicked out of Romania, and they produced the most sensational accounts of the brutality of Vlad. So this is what some historians think. He has been unfairly maligned by these people, and the most outrageous legends we hear about him, that he executes entire feasts of people at one time. It's kind of similar with Ivan the Terrible. He's called that by German merchants who also were kind of on the wrong end of Vlad's policies and returned to lands west and produce accounts of him. But in Russia, he's known as Ivan the Great. So the most sensational accounts we have of them are foreign Germans, essentially, and this is a source of some of the figures that some historians now think might not have gotten the most fair shake. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
Yeah, like if you had in the beginning one of those German merchants and he's chronicling this, and you go between his chronicle of the vampire Vlad and then the real Vlad, like that's shaping up to be a good movie. I think that this movie went like 40% there.
Yeah, I could see...
and then it fell apart.
If it were something intelligent, like an HBO miniseries or something for more thinking audiences and having that kind of narrative smarts of people doing different accounts. But